We've had a lot of people ask us how to get into building miniatures. Literally, how to get into building them. So we thought today we'd let you know exactly A to Z how to get started in assembling all sorts of materials that miniatures come in.
That's right, we've decided to make something that you would call evergreen content. A resource that can hopefully be useful to you if you're brand new to the hobby, or even if you're experienced, you might get a few tips or tricks on how to better utilize the different materials you might be working with in the past, present, or future. It's tabletop time!
Now, the most common material that you'll probably come across when making models is plastic models on some sort of sprue. And since it's so common, there's quite a few ways you can go around preparing your models. So with that being said, the first tool you're probably going to want for taking your plastic models off the plastic sprues is some sort of cutting implement. And scissors just ain't gonna cut it, literally. So you're gonna want something along the lines of clippers, starting from the most basic, which is just basically hardware clippers. This will only do so much. This is not a precision tool by any means. And then you move into the territory of actual hobby products. And we have here a fairly simple and common clippers. These are just a flat-headed cutter. You can get up really nice, and there's not much around the head of these to get in the way, as opposed to the very bulbous wire cutters. But if you wanted to go up another step, you will quickly get into the territory of more expensive clippers, very fine precision tools. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to use the middle of the range piece, just to give you a better idea of the more approachable material and tool. By now taking a close look at all the parts that we've clipped off, you can immediately see that the mold lines are very visible now. These are formed by the two halves of the original mold pressing together, and there's always just a little bit that will escape out and create these lines. And while mold lines aren't the worst nightmare of everyone, some people really want to get rid of them, as it really detracts from, I suppose, the immersion of your little fantasy or sci-fi figurine running around. So I'm going to grab my first tool, the file, and just start about removing some of the mold line here from this leg. And you can see here it practically took no time at all, just some simple rubs here, like rubbing a magic lamp and suddenly the mold line is gone.
Hi, it's Vince with ShamWow.
But it has left just a little bit of a scuff. You can see that the plastic here just isn't as fine and clean as the other areas now. So I'll swap over to the mold line remover, the equivalent of a knife that can be sold to children. That was a sentence. And you can see this literally scrapes away a thin layer of the plastic, leaving it quite smooth underneath. And having used this literally for the first time here, I'm going to say that this probably works exceptionally well on big flat surfaces, but I'm not so sure about really fine, intricate, detailed surfaces. And then of course there is the trusty old scalpel, which is used exactly in the same way as the mold line remover. It's just a bit more hazardous if you slip. And with that process all done, definitely made more laborious the more bits of plastic that you have to build. Like if you're doing a whole squad or an army all at once, this can take a while. And so a lot of people decide to skip some of this process, which is entirely justified, to be completely honest. But now it is time to glue the model together. Now, once again, you can use something very simple like super glue from your hardware store, but specific plastic cements and plastic glues are usually the best for miniatures that you've spent a little bit of money on. Now, the most efficient way that is recommended to use plastic glue is to apply a bit to each piece that you're going to try and join together. Let the plastic glue settle on those pieces, as this is actually starting to melt those bits of plastic a little bit. You join them together, and the melted plastic is actually going to fuse together, and it will form a single piece, which makes it very strong, but I must stress, makes it very difficult to get it apart again. So make sure that you're joining it where you want it. And there we have it. We've finished prepping a plastic miniature here. Some other materials require just a little bit more before you start painting. This one can be primed right now, as long as the glue is already dried. So I think it's time to move on to preparing the next material.
3D printed models. Now, these are made of resin. This is a kind of photosensitive resin, and the way it basically works is you have a vat inside these 3D printers full of goo, and then it exposes UV light onto the bottom layer. That cures the resin, and then it pulls up out of the goo, curing layer by layer, and ultimately building your 3D printed model. Now, you'll often receive these models from smaller companies or Etsy stores that are reprinting models made available on Patreons or by projects such as our Kindred of the Abyss. Once the models are printed, the preparation needs to begin immediately. 3D printer resin can be quite an irritant to the skin, and you definitely don't want it anywhere near your eyes and your mouth. So it's important to wear good gloves, recommended nitrile gloves because they actually keep isopropyl alcohol out, and to clean the models in isopropyl alcohol. That's where you'll come over to a wash station. These are full of isopropyl alcohol, and they'll spin that model and get rid of any uncured resin for you. And once you've done that, you'll be left with something like this. So this is a model that has been washed but has supports on it. Now it's important to remember there's a little bit of residue that can still be on here if it hasn't been cured for a second time. So at this stage, it's still a good idea to wear gloves. Now we're gonna go and remove the supports, but then there'll still be one more step before you've finished prepping your 3D printed model. So 3D printed resin has a few properties, but there are so many different varieties that are all slightly different that it's kind of impossible to do a comprehensive guide on every single variant you could find. In general, 3D printer resin is more brittle than things like plastic. It's more prone to snapping and breaking, and when it does break, it breaks into shards rather than stretching, crushing, and bending in the way that plastic does. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this. The first way is to be extremely careful and slow. Use a scalpel or a small knife to remove all of the supports from the model on the contact point, being careful to gently scrape it away and leave the model as pristine as possible. One of the negative aspects to removing these supports from 3D printing is they can often leave what I can kind of call acne scars on the model. These pock marks where all of the supports were left create tiny micro craters across the surface of the model, and these are actually really hard to clean up effectively. If you scrape over them and remove the crater rim, you often still have a small imperfection or indent underneath, and as the resin is more brittle than plastics, it also doesn't scrape, sand, or glide smoothly. This is one of the areas where most 3D printer resins kind of have a little bit of a downside versus plastic, but it's often made up for by the ease of manufacture, how cheap and accessible the models can be. But as technology is improving, this is improving as well, and 3D models are getting better and better. If you don't like the idea of spending all of this time on the model, a second method is to simply pull off the supports. Yeah, you heard me right, you kind of just tear them off. Now this does leave the most pock marks on the underside of the model, but if you're careful with where the supports were placed on the model, these will generally be on the underside and lower surfaces where no one will really see them, or they'll be hidden in the shaded recesses. After this technique, you can use a knife to just clean up the more obvious ones in areas you might still be able to see, scraping the surfaces of the model to remove those pock marks as best as possible. And a third and final approach I can recommend is also a bit of a hybrid method, where you focus on the delicate areas of the model. In this case, you can see that we have a rogue assassin. This is actually Jen's D&D character right now, and what we can do is use the blade to remove all the supports from those sharp, small daggers and her thin arms and hat. These slender, high detail areas of the 3D model are in fact one of the perks of 3D modeling. You can get these extremely intricate, true to scale details in this material, and by using the knife to clean off the supports in this area, they don't risk being damaged. Once the delicate areas are cleaned up, you can then use the second method of just tearing off the remaining supports. I think this hybrid method is probably the most efficient, where you manually remove the supports in the areas where they're most delicate, or pressing, or could cause the most issues, and then pull off the remainder of the supports from the areas it's not going to be a big problem. Once this is done, you can go around with a knife and just clean up any of the most obvious pockmarks on the models, but overall, this is in fact most of the process for cleaning and preparing 3D printed models. The final step is to UV cure them. So this final step in the process ensures that the resin is fully cured. Any tiny bits of residue that were on the outside of the model are now gone because they get baked in this UV light. It also means you can finally take off your gloves. Now, unlike plastic miniatures, 3D model resin only adheres to itself with glues like PVA, but more realistically, we're talking super glue. Because resin is not plastic, the plastic glue that melts down the two sides of the plastic and joins them together won't work on resin miniatures, so you're best off just using super glue from a craft store or from a supermarket. Applying some super glue, waiting a little bit of time for it to get tacky but not too long, and pressing the model down, and it will glue up in a jiffy. But the problem with super glue is the bonds can be incredibly strong, so once you glue, you will often find if you break your model, it won't break at the glue seams because 3D printer resin is brittle. It will actually just break the model. As long as you remember to adequately wash your model, wear safety protection, and also to clean it up before you do that final UV cure, you will find preparing 3D printed models is actually super easy. With the one downside being those small pockmarks can be almost impossible to remove without an extreme amount of time and patience, as the material itself doesn't take to sanding, filing, or carving and cutting nearly as well as cast resin or plastic. So that's 3D printer resin, the most modern form of miniature construction.
But I'm going to talk to you about a different kind of resin, and that is cast resin, or a lot of people know it, Forge World resin. Now, much in the same way as plastic miniatures, cast resin here is in fact cast into a mold, or a sprue, pretty much. Historically, the difference here between plastic and cast resin is that you are able to get a lot more detail in the resin here, as the particular properties of the resin allow for that sort of minute detail. However, over the years, plastic has become so good and so advanced that it easily rivals resin even today. And then of course, I'm going to start scraping away at all the mold lines here, which aren't as many. However, this is where all the flashing comes in. Right here you can see a perfect example where the two halves of the casting tool have met, but not quite all the way, allowing a tiny amount of resin to seep into here, and it creates this little skin of resin here just between all the parts. Now, to touch on a bit of the meme of Forge World resin here, Forge World particularly gets a bit of a bad rap, as entering the hobby or perhaps being a part of it for a while, you may have heard the parts for Forge World models don't fit together, or there's huge gaps that need filling, or there's warping and bending and all sorts of things. And while I'm going to say that this isn't going to be the case all the time, this certainly happens, as resin does tend to warp and contort while it's being either made, moved, or just in ambient heat. It can tend to realign itself. And so you can probably see the correlation between people building really big Forge World kits and the amount of issues that they're going to have with all the parts that don't line up. However, conversely, the smaller the kit is, usually the easier time you will have dealing with it. And now that I've provided that little bit of customer service, I'm going to finish cleaning up the rest of this model. As you see, in the process of making cast resin, you use all sorts of products here to separate from the silicone molds that you use. These include powders and all sorts of chemicals just to help loosen them off and make them easier to deal with. The issue here is that these are usually still present on the pieces when you receive them. And what your paints and aerosol primers really don't like to bind with is exactly these kinds of oils and chemicals. And so now we are literally going to go and clean the parts. Literally. Hot, soapy water. Boom. Grab an old toothbrush, not your siblings, and give it a good scrub, and you'll remove all of these particles. I will absolutely say now, don't be tempted to skip this step, as having a fully finished miniature and watching the paint slough off as you try again and again to apply it is extremely irritating, so absolutely do this step. And now that you've finished cleaning this and allowed it to dry, it is time to actually glue it together. And for this, just use super glue. Cheap stuff, works fine. And boom, your cast resin miniature is now all assembled, cleaned, and ready to prime and paint. And for the last segment in this video, I'm going to hand over to Dave and he'll show you all about metal models.
Now, the final type of model we are going to be looking at today is white metal models. And the model I'm going to be assembling is a model from the game Infinity. With everything we've learned up to now, I'd say they are most similar to Forge World or cast resin models in how you prepare them, but there's a few key differences. Metal models will often have these squiggly little lines. These are the sprue gates or the casting gates that allow the metal to flow in and air to flow out of the model when they're cast. What they do leave though is these little tags that look like belts or strips hanging from the model. Now, these can fold over and bend and be in various hidden nooks and crannies in the miniature, so it's important to find and identify all of these and sort of straighten them out and then remove them. To remove them, you can use clippers or you can use a knife, but I do have some important considerations I want to let you know. White metal is a soft metal, but it is still metal, which means of all the materials we work with today, it is the firmest and the most difficult to carve away at, shave down with a file, or cut with clippers. It is almost certainly guaranteed to damage the tools you use to work with it. So I really recommend, if you are going to use clippers on white metal miniatures, to either use specially designed clippers for white metal or use the cheapest options available to you. As for knives, because there's a lot of tension required to carve it or cut it with a knife, I would recommend being extremely careful here. Personally, I do use a knife quite a bit on white metal miniatures, but for my personal preference, I like to use a very old and dull blade. This means I'm almost using it more like a file or carving tool rather than a sharp scalpel blade. However, this is where we come to files as an alternative. Once you've removed things like the tags and gates, a file can be used to clean up the surface that it's attached to. And this is a lot safer than using something like a knife to carve across the surface, although you can still use the backside of the blade to clean up any mold lines. Beyond this, you'll see that the process is pretty similar to working with cast resin. And much like cast resin, metal requires super glue to be glued together effectively. Now, I am going to take a little aside here to talk about drilling. I'm not drilling this mini as as it is so small and light, I don't think it will be necessary, but often when assembling resin or white metal miniatures, it's important to pin your models. We're gonna use some footage from my video of when I assembled Fulgrim to show you some of this, but basically the way it works is you use a hand drill or a pin vise to carefully drill a hole into either surface on the model. You can then use a small piece of brass rod or perhaps an unbent paper clip to provide structural support to the model when it joins together. Think of this as the rebar in some concrete when they're building a building. It ensures everything connects together straight and strong. With those considerations out of the way, a white metal model can be assembled much like anything else, simply glued together, and you can paint it straight out of the gate. Although another consideration is paint will not adhere as effectively to white metal as any of the other materials. It's important to use a really good paint primer here, and this is one of the areas where the Games Workshop Chaos Black Spray is actually worth its money, as it does lay a really good foundation for miniature paints. But after you finish painting a white metal miniature, I also recommend using a top coat or a varnish because the paint can chip off these models really easily. However, on the plus side, you have a weighty and durable miniature that has a really good game feel on the table. I do like lugging around metal and resin minis. And that's pretty much all there is to say about the 101s of miniature painting. So let's take a quick look at all of the minis we've assembled today and give a thanks to our patrons while we're at it. I just want to do a big, beautiful thank you to our wonderful patrons. It's because of you that we've managed to keep going for as long as we have, and we continue to make videos. As a perk of joining our Patreon, you get a shout out in our videos, so it's time to shout out some more of our new patrons. Robert Kovalevic, Tori, Grant M. Viteznik, Sam C, and Corentin Bernard. We really appreciate it. Welcome. Hope you find a home in our miniature Discord and enjoy the behind the scenes we post every week over on Patreon. Well, hopefully you found something of use in that video, and there are a couple of tips you might not have thought of before that might help you in crafting your miniatures.
Yeah, or maybe just a little bit of a history lesson on some of the materials that aren't as prevalent anymore.
Or you'll be able to follow this along and then pick out all the times we haven't done the things that we've told you to do in this video.
Like when we didn't drill the barrels in the giant tank on our Krieg board.
We ran out of time, okay? We forgot, okay? Sometimes that happens too.
Please go through all our videos and leave comments on where we messed up. It'll be great for our algorithm.
Yeah, it will make us feel really good too. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks everyone for watching. And if you'd like more evergreen resource kind of videos like this, we'd love to make them. Some of my favorite moments when I've been out and about on the rare times we've gone to conventions and such is when you get someone come up to you and say like, because of you, we started the hobby or we started getting into miniatures.
To which we apologize profusely.
So hopefully this is useful to those people. Thanks for watching, guys.
See you later. My fate, for free!